Thank you for that rousing welcome. And this is our third stop in Victoria. Of 17 stops, I'm just deeply honored that the Canadian people are open and receptive to the truths that we are here to talk about. It's a very difficult subject, the destruction of the World Trade Center on 9/11 and the staggering loss of life. You know, just as architecture and engineering projects are sometimes quite difficult, sometimes extremely joyful, this particular project has proven to be one of the most difficult. And not difficult in terms of reaching conclusions, though, but difficult in terms of the implications of those conclusions and finding people open-minded and willing enough, like yourselves, to come and look at the evidence. Because as you'll see, that's the most difficult part of this, getting people to actually look at the evidence. I just want you to know that we have now 2,100 architects and engineers demanding a real investigation, 19,000 others, and we want you, and we'll show you how to sign our petition only after you look at the evidence, as I did in 2006. Until then, I was an architect, a normal architect with a job, and I got paid to work on these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums in the San Francisco Bay Area and the $125 million construction administration project for this high school in the Bay Area. And after that, in Las Vegas, this $400 million project with 1,200 tons of steel framing, retail parking structure, and a mid-rise office space here. So that's just a little bit about me, and we have a website that we started, and so we're going to be flying through this evidence. You're not going to be bored tonight. Let's jump right in and find out how the official myth got started on 9/11.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience.
So what was attacked again? He admitted it.
Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, there's the official story in a nutshell, right there from one of the key engineers that came to write the FEMA report, Gene Corley. So what we're going to do now is look very carefully at that theory. And we're going to use the scientific method because in the West we've been given this easy, we call it easy, we all learned it in grade school, but it took 100 years to develop for some reason. We formulate a question, how did the towers come down? We do background research and make some observations. We construct a hypothesis, our best guess as to how they came down. Maybe they came down by fires, or did they come down by controlled demolition? We test that hypothesis with experiments. We analyze the results, draw conclusions, and if the hypothesis is corroborated, we report it in an open, transparent manner. So all following researchers can build on the body of each other's evidence. This is how it's done. Now, we're going to test how NIST worked with the scientific method and through every one of these, in fact, but particularly the results, the reporting of the results. Open, transparent manner. We're going to find, for instance, that NIST did not allow anyone to look at their input data for their computer models. We have FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, that where in our country, and hopefully yours, you can get information from your government. They can't hide it unless it's classified. But they did. They said it would jeopardize public safety if we were to give you, the engineers, requesting this information as to how this high-rise came down. Wait a minute. We're designing high-rises. We need this information. Okay, that's just one example. We're going to look at quite a few. But let's apply this scientific method to our work by doing some background research. Find out what are the forces that destroy buildings. For instance, fire is one example, right? Fire burns through a building every 20 minutes or so in a high-rise office building. That's all the fuel there is there, desks and paper. So it moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when there is a collapse due to fire, and by the way, that's never happened in a high-rise building ever before 9/11, and there's been 100 examples of hot, large, and very long-lasting fires in these buildings. But say in a wood frame building, like I think this one, if it were on fire, the fire would travel around, and if the building were going to fall, it would fall over, or it wouldn't go straight down through the path of greatest resistance, all the columns in the buildings at once, as you'll see. In fact, let's look and see what happens in a steel building, because there are tests done. Very valuable information here.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, the fires, normal fires, are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, where on 9/11, he's talking about, we had not one, not two, but as you'll see, 3 high-rises collapse substantially due to fire. So this is extremely important information. This is the background research that's part of the scientific method. We need to understand historically what has happened in steel frame buildings. Like this one, 3.5 hours over 5 floors in Los Angeles, this fire burned. And in Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors. And in Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors. Did any of them collapse? No. So this is extremely important, again, to understand the history. And this is not included in the NIST report either, as is examples of buildings that have fallen over, in these cases due to earthquakes. An organic, asymmetrical collapse. So you see a building on the ground, it's recognizable, mangled certainly, but the structural system is not completely dismembered, one beam from another column. The concrete is not pulverized. So we're going to file this information in our minds before we go and apply it and use it as a reference point against the evidence that we're going to be seeing. Now, these buildings are destroyed by explosives. We have thick, billowing, enormous, pyroclastic-like clouds. Comes from volcanic, where there's an eruption and the air is filled with pulverized solids with a thickly defined cloud forming and heat that's generating cauliflower shapes from the incredible chemical reactions going on. In this case, there's witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. So what we're looking at is comparing fires to explosions. It's not that difficult. Explosions can be harnessed very effectively in controlled demolitions. Thousands of cutter charges are placed in the columns and beams in the building, and they're engineered to synchronistically go off in a timed fashion, floor by floor, often from the bottom up, as you see here. But you'll also see they can be arranged in different ways. So the result is a free fall acceleration. The structure, the columnar structure has been removed. And we have a symmetrical collapse usually, straight down. One member is broken from another, so it's ready for loading and shipment. This is a feat that only a handful of companies in the United States can even accomplish. And fire never has. So again, it's just not that difficult. In fact, there are typical features of controlled demolition. We mentioned several of them just now, but they also include enormous clouds of pulverized concrete, squibs, or isolated explosive ejections that go off in various places, and chemical evidence of cutter charges or explosives or incendiaries left behind in the debris field. So if you have all these, you know you have direct evidence of explosive destruction. Now, fire can't create any one of these, let alone all 10 of them. So we're going to have some fun tonight making our comparison, especially since we'll be looking for government documentation itself that is very helpful in determining the outcome. Experts, those who are not already biased by $10,000 contracts with the federal government, who may not want to tell the truth and sacrifice those contracts, but say unbiased experts and foreknowledge of destruction. I mean, these controlled demolitions take months to plan and place, so if people know about it in advance. Very, very, very helpful information. All of this is, of course, proof of controlled demolition. So with that in mind, what we're going to do is take a look at World Trade Center 7. Most architects and engineers know nothing about the destruction of this third high-rise on 9/11, including me in 2006, even though it's the third worst structural failure in modern history. Should have been studied as closely as the Columbia Space Shuttle, for instance. Every architect and engineer should know a lot about how this happened, because we have hundreds and hundreds of high-rises that may be vulnerable. Building 7 was not hit by an airplane, did not have jet fuel in it like the two Twin Towers, which we'll get to in a moment. It's about half the height of that building, and about 3 times the height of the, which building was that again? The View Street building, the apartment building here in town. So this would be the tallest building in most of our states. It's dwarfed, of course, sitting next to the Twin Towers. And so what happens on 9/11, the Twin Towers went down. We'll talk about that in a minute. But Building 7 is left until about 5:20 in the afternoon when something very mysterious happens to it. Let's take a look at the features of that mysterious something and see if there are any features of controlled demolition. Starting with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? Let's listen to Dan Rather narrate his viewing of this building as we watch, for many of us. Well, let me ask you, how many before tonight were relatively unfamiliar with Building 7? If you give me a hand count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Nobody in 13, thank you. So, 13 of us. Let's see what Dan Rather says.
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Okay, so that's not evidence, right? That's just one man giving his opinion. I get that part. But that was never repeated by Dan ever again. In fact, this building was never shown on mainstream media, with the exception possibly 3 times in the last 12 or more years. So here we have an incredible building failure that is receiving no attention from the media and completely inadequate attention from the architecture and engineering community. Does it go straight down, symmetrical, into its own footprint? Let's see. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Watch the top. The penthouse goes down just a second before. We'll see what that means in just a moment. Okay, very interesting. Maybe we're getting somewhere now. Let's compare it to a known controlled demolition on the right, building 7 on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like one, and every building that has been brought down, a high-rise or mid-rise building, has been brought down by explosives, and none of them have been brought down by fires. Let's get real. I'm talking about these fires. Small, scattered fires, normal office fires. These normal office fires are said to have been responsible for this building's failure. Okay? No question about that. In fact, it's on the 12th floor. There were fires about 2:30, 3 o'clock on the 12th floor. Now, the problem is that those fires are said to have caused these beams under the 13th floor to expand. Well, they couldn't have done that because they're fireproofed. They're insulated from expansion, from getting too hot. But if they weren't insulated, let's say, they still couldn't expand because they're tied structurally to the concrete slab up above with what we call shear studs. But let's say those weren't there, because NIST said they weren't there, but documents show that they were there. They're said to have pushed this girder off of its seat on this column. But that couldn't have happened because this girder is also tied with shear studs every 24 inches or so along the length of that girder, tying it into a slab. So, but let's say those weren't there because NIST said they weren't there. The maximum possible expansion of those beams could not have even pushed it halfway off of its seat on that column, because there were stiffeners inside this, and I'll show you those in a minute. We're just going to blast through this part. So it could not have fallen the way NIST said. But let's say that could have happened. This whole floor is said to have fallen on this floor, and so on for 9 floors in a pancaking collapse inside the building prior to the overall shell coming down. That could never have happened, though, because there's 2 other girders framing into that column from the other side that would have kept that floor from pancaking down. So, and even if that would have happened, if there was an interior collapse which traveled vertically, that is to say the instability traveling vertically, and then horizontally gutting the inside of this massive building the size of a football field without telegraphing in the perimeter structure any deformation or massive breaking of windows, impossible, absolutely impossible. These stiffeners would have kept all that from happening, so we are suing NIST in a legal action to begin with because they omitted key information from the structural shop drawings that show not only the shear studs, but these girders. Now, even if all that could have happened, it wouldn't have. Why? Because those fires on the 12th floor have been proven to be burned out an hour prior to the building's failure. The theory is thermal expansion of those beams. That has to be happening during a fire, but the fire was out. So NIST has so many areas, and in the last 5 minutes we've covered a dozen of them, and there are dozens and dozens that I'm not going to bore you with except for one more thing. The computer model that NIST used to prove its scenario completely disproves it. First of all, they stop the computer model after 2 seconds, and they don't show us what happened during the 7-second collapse. It starts to tip over, like we would expect an organic asymmetrical collapse to behave. Even the computer model cannot be faked in order to produce what we actually see. Plus, what you're seeing is the failure of 400 structural steel connections per second. That's like firing a hose on a sandcastle. It just could never happen in reality. The releasing of all of these beam-to-column connections is done in the computer model, giving them no internal integrity, and so that's how they're trying to get it to fail. So you can see why we have a problem. Plus, even in the computer model, after 2 seconds, there's massive deformation, and would have been massive. You would have seen it, but you don't. You don't see massive window breakage, for instance. So how do they get a building to fall straight down into its own footprint? You have to remove all 80 columns virtually at once on each of 8 given floors. 8 because that's the period of free fall that it had. We'll get to that. Now, how does fire remove all 80 columns at once, given that it moves organically around the building every 20 minutes or so? Completely impossible. We're pointing out a dozen features that are impossible, that the official story relies on, that are impossible to even happen. So, free fall is one of them, by the way. This building is falling, as you can see, gaining downward momentum every second, a lot more downward momentum. That's acceleration, increasing the speed every second, and it fits the free fall curve exactly. The building is completely destroyed in 7 seconds. Starts slow, ends up fast. Let me show you what I mean. How fast did this building fall? It's falling at free fall acceleration. 3, 2, 1. No resistance underneath the brick. That's how it falls at free fall. Maybe a little bit of air resistance. The building is falling with no resistance, not from any one of those 80 columns. That's important information, and NIST denied that for years until they were cornered publicly by a math teacher and physics teacher, David Chandler, one of our petition signers. He says, that's like taking 8 stories out of the building all at once, because it fell at free fall for 2¼ seconds, a third of its fall. Fascinating. Resulting, of course, in the total dismemberment of the steel structure as well. I mean, here's a 47-story skyscraper with beam-to-column connections that are very rigid, welded in many places. If that was going to fall, you can imagine that it might be 20 stories tall and crumpled and just a huge mess. Each floor was the size of a football field, 47 of them. And yet, we're talking 4 or 5 stories tall, this pile, like a house of cards. Remember, buildings that fall organically, their structural system doesn't disintegrate or shatter. Do we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions? Interesting. Here's Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom! It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my
And Barry
mind.
Jennings, who worked in the 23rd floor, and they had evacuated Building 7 after the planes hit the buildings. Theoretically, no one died there, but there's some testimony to contradict that. But that's not our point. He somehow went back up into the building with the attorney of Mayor Giuliani, Michael Hess, and they're experiencing this.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions. You know,
What sort of sound?
like a boom, like an explosion.
And more than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs, we made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Why would this information being blown around in the stairwells of these buildings not be critically important to any serious investigation with integrity? We will come to the evidence of cutter charges or explosives when we get to the Twin Towers. But for now, we're talking about 8 characteristic features of direct evidence of explosions, not one of which can be explained by fire. Speaking of which, the World Trade Center 5 was completely engulfed, a mid-rise office building. If any of the World Trade Center buildings were going to fall due to fire, we'd expect it to be it. But no, it doesn't collapse. Never has a building collapsed other than the 3 high-rises we're examining closely tonight. Neither this one in China, 2009, Beijing, burning floor to ground to the roof, 44 stories. Did it come down? No. Toasted around the edges, but still, this is before, this is after. So we just don't have, except for Building 7, with these small fires, fires bringing these high-rises down. Doesn't happen. And this one happened, of course, in 6.5 seconds, actually, into a 4-story pile, like a house of cards. Well, what did the original FEMA report say in 2002 of May, when it came out? Because they had $600,000 of funding. The specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. Here's a $600,000. They're not committing at all. And it gets better. Look at this. The best hypothesis, fire plus random damage, then complete collapse, has only a low probability of occurrence. Whoa, your best hypothesis has only a low probability of occurrence? That means it's not corroborated. What do you do when that happens? You go back and you construct a new one. And that's what they're saying here. Further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. But then NIST came in, took over the investigation, threw out the best evidence, as you'll see, but only after 99.9% of the steel from all 3 towers was shipped to China for recycling before the investigators could even look at it, most of it. So we have a serious problem here. In fact, Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, says, crucial evidence that can answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. Well, what do other experts say? Again, experts that don't have a stake in the official myth of 9/11, like the top European controlled demolition expert in Europe, Danny Jawenko. 27 years in the business. Starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. A team of experts did this. It's controlled demolition. Professional work, without a doubt. And this is an opinion he was making before he even knew this was part of 9/11. He's just shown a building coming down. This is what he said. Then they told him, hey, this happened on 9/11. He goes, what? That's crazy. They must have worked very fast, is what he said. But of course, it takes months to plan these things, as we'll see. We have 60 to 80 structural engineers, depending on how you count them, on our petition Here's Kamal Obeid with a very conservative opinion. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and pattern loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Right, how does that happen? It only happens one way, and that's with removing those columns all at once, and that can only be done with explosives. So did anybody know about this in advance? Well, here's several mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion, which you'll hear immediately, looking back over their shoulder to the building, then looking straight into the eye of the camera and saying this.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
Building is about to blow up. Moving back.
All right, guys. Sorry.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
How do they know the building is about to blow up if it's just on fire and has a few fires in it? The firemen were told not to go in there, actually. They were told it had structural damage, and so shouldn't go in there, and they just let it burn. They're all scratching their heads wondering, we know how to put out fires. And there's no real, well, some beams hit the building, and there was some structural damage. NIST says this is not a significant factor, this structural damage by these beams. Nor was there diesel fuel fires in the building, according to the official story. We're talking about normal office fires. And this gentleman, before he stated what he said about the explosions, was moved along with dozens and dozens of other people 6 blocks back away from Building 7, and he's listening to a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? No, something else is going on here. In fact, the BBC picks it up almost immediately. 20 minutes before it happened. That's even better than immediate. That's the best kind of reporting you can get. When you get the script and you read it before it happens, they say, apologize for this confusing event. They cite the confusing events of the day, as if that makes them psychic or something. How do they know? Well, even better than Jane Stanley at the BBC announcing this 20 minutes before it happens is this gentleman from CNN who announced it earlier that morning at 11:07.
In New York, Alan Dodd-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Aaron, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke was like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Sabga and others have told you, all of Manhattan is covered, downtown Manhattan is covered with thick white ash and building material.
15 minutes after the second tower went down, they're announcing the collapse of a 50-story building. There was no other 50-story building that went down. In fact, there was no other buildings that went down. Some were severely damaged, but none of them collapsed on their own afterwards. They're talking about Building 7. I mean, that's all they can be talking about. And yet it didn't go down, of course, 7 hours later. Had Building 7 gone down at the time they said it did, it would have been completely obscured in the massive dust cloud created when the Twin Towers went down. So many researchers, 9/11 Truth researchers, believe that it was supposed to have gone down then, that it was a dud. And that's why they're all expecting Building 7 to come down. But it takes longer and longer, and the firefighters are told not to go in. Larry Silverstein, according to one witness who supports his theory even, says that he heard Larry Silverstein on the phone with his insurance agent asking them if they would rebuild the building for him if he took it down because it had foundation damage. So that's one witness who actually stands by that story, Mike Shapiro. This is fascinating. Maybe those mysterious construction workers are coming out of the building having fixed the problem that kept it from going down when it was supposed to. That's all speculation. What's not is the evidence that we've been talking about. And that evidence leads to a hypothesis which we believe is corroborated because these eight key features of controlled demolition cannot be explained by fire. With additional corroborative evidence, I'm asking you actually right now, is this proof to you of controlled demolition? So let me ask you those same three questions about Building 7 this time. How many of you agree with that this Building 7 came down by normal office fires according to the official theory by NIST? Normal office fires. Anybody? Be honest with me now. I'm being honest with you. You might still be unsure. That happens in every crowd, so don't feel bad if... Is there anybody? Am I missing anybody? Not one person is unsure about this. There's one. Thank you. Two, you're bordering between unsure and convinced. That's okay. So I was unsure the first time I came into contact. How many of you think this building was brought down by controlled demolition? Okay. Everybody has to vote now. So the room has weighed in. Okay? Now, what is your problem? Those of you who just raised your hand. And my problem, because I join you, right? We have a serious problem here. Building 7 was a part of the 9/11 conspiracy. No matter how you define that conspiracy, right? It's a conspiracy if hijackers flew planes into the buildings. It's a conspiracy if someone else planted explosives in here. But who? After all, CIA was in this building. The Secret Service was in this building. The IRS. This is a very well-defended building, wouldn't you imagine? Department of Defense, in fact. Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management, the place that handles the hurricanes and other emergencies like 9/11, which they abandoned this place or after the planes hit, in fact. Securities and Exchange Commission, guess what floor they were on? The 12th floor, the one with the worst fires. They lost thousands of files related to hundreds of cases that they were actively pursuing against Wall Street companies like Enron and WorldCom. So we certainly want an investigation of those fires as well. We don't believe, well, this is speculation, but I don't think Al-Qaeda got into this building to plant these explosives. So we're looking for an investigation that lets the chips fall where they may, right? So that's why we raised $400,000 in September and had a massive billboard campaign, and including here in Victoria, a large billboard and bus ads. In fact, the bus ads in Ottawa were responsible for the Ottawa Transportation Committee to have a meeting and decide we can't allow these ads. They're upsetting the families of the 9/11 victims. The families of the 9/11 victims started the 9/11 Truth Movement. We're here to serve them and their pursuit of justice. That's why we are here. That's what we're doing. I may be an architect, but I don't give a crap about buildings. I'm here for the deeper implications that are obvious once you start looking at the evidence, okay? I start with the evidence, but I am trying to lead myself and those who agree with the evidence to the deeper mysteries, the deeper injustices perpetrated on the families of 9/11. In fact, the whole world, Muslims in particular, and Afghanistan and Iraq, where millions of people have been killed. So, do you think we have a problem? We're going to get to it. I want you to be a part of the solution, so I'm going to invite you to get even more informed. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, tasked with explaining these three collapses. And they have some serious problems with their official reports, which were not investigations. So we're after an investigation. And so we want your support. We also have something else you can do here in Canada. You can contact that guy, and it takes 5 seconds once you get online, because we've got it all set up. You just hit a button, you put your name in there and your email, and he will be contacted. Who is that guy? He is your not your, but an NDP Parliament member. Paul Dewar, he's been handed a petition with 1,400 of your signatures on it. And instead of adding more signatures, we want you to add more pressure. And we want you to do that by going online, tiny URL, that's easy, /petition NDP. You can do it now on your smartphone, and it'll take you right there, and you can hit a button, and he gets an email. It's already written. It says, hey, Dewar, read the petition in Parliament. That's his duty. When he gets a petition with that many signatures on it, that's what he's supposed to do. We want thousands of such emails by the time we get across the country to Newfoundland. So please help out. Now, if you forget all that, rethink911.ca. Just write it down and go to that website when you get home. Send in that petition, because not only Building 7 is a problem here, but the Twin Towers. And so I want to show you a film we made, which is a trailer for it, a couple of minutes, that's, we think, pretty powerful.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. You know, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the document from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved in melting those steel beams.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Now, that DVD is also available tonight in the back, in the foyer, $10, an 88-minute DVD, and that supports our work and gets you and your neighbors and architects and engineers that you can find, and MPs that you can find, and media officials that you can find, friends, family. You'll lose a few, but it's worth it. It's the effort of truth, okay? We also have a 15-minute Building 7 documentary. It's just 15 minutes. Ed Asner, famous actor in the U.S., one of our best supporters, is the narrator, and he does a fantastic job. I mean, it's even better than my presentations, if you can imagine. So, speaking of which, let's just jump into the meat of tonight's presentation. The World Trade Center towers, okay? We have to, once you look with a new set of glasses at the evidence that the media didn't show you, but even the videos that they did show you, you're going to see that it's even more clear than Building 7, which is very interesting. Now, regarding the Twin Towers, Minoru Yamasaki was the architect, and he designed what some called sculptural purity. They just loved it. Other people, like Robert Stern, a famous architect in the U.S., says it's gigantic dumbness, right? You just take two squares and you extrude them until they become the tallest buildings in the world. Before that, this elegant building was what we took pride in, the Empire State Building in the U.S. Regardless of its aesthetics, the engineering achieved something remarkable and was praised for, even by NIST. And what NIST said is, the structure did its job, and it did its job because we're marching 14-inch columns every 3 feet 9 inches on center around this building. It's literally a fortress of structure around the outside and the inside, because they grouped the columns on the inside around the elevator shafts, allowing 60 feet of open office planning on opportunity on each side and 35 feet on the other. This is a column at the bottom of the towers. It's virtually solid steel, 52 inches by 22 inches. And then it gets a little bit smaller, about halfway up. And then at the top is the very lightest, maybe 3/8 of an inch thick at the top. But look at the massive steel structure. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, that it was only about half occupied at the time of 9/11, because this is like a jail cell. There's more steel here than windows. Very undesirable, especially in the 80s, 90s, as the curtain walls of these architectural high-rises, the architecture started really improving for usability. But the steel itself, it's a 100,000-ton heat sink. Any fire that NIST claims was 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, 900 degrees Celsius, would have conducted that heat away from the source, keeping that steel from ever softening to the point of collapse. So, what happened here? At 8:46, Flight 11 hits the building, and about 102 minutes later, it collapses. After it's hit, the South Tower is hit, and only 56 minutes later, it collapses. So we're talking about at least an hour to an hour and a half before these buildings collapse, after they're hit. So the planes did not bring the buildings down. Even NIST says that. It's the fires that brought them down. In fact, it's not even the jet fuel. NIST says the jet fuel, 90% of it burned up outside the building. The rest of it burned up in 10 minutes. So 50 minutes later, we're talking about normal office fires, according to the official story. And that softened the steel. And we'll take a look at that, because this steel was more vulnerable. These open web steel trusses, they're lightweight. The plane theoretically knocked off the fireproofing, and then they were more vulnerable to the heat. Okay, I get that. What I don't get is that how a sagging truss pulled in those heavy steel columns. There's no additional lateral load by a sagging truss. It's not quite intuitive, but it's true. There's very little additional lateral load. So what does NIST do to overcome that? They impose a 5,000-pound artificial load horizontally on every one of those columns in order to get that building to fail in their computer model. You know what we call that? Fraud. There's no other word for it. They just say, well, we saw the building come down, so we had to do what we had to do in the computer models to make it come down. Right? This is called evidence not supporting your hypothesis and manufacturing experimental data to make up for that. Fraud. No other word for it. But we're going to look and concentrate on the evidence for controlled demolition. Because we're not talking about what fires can or can't do to buildings. We're not talking about what planes can or can't do to buildings. It's irrelevant. Okay? So when you argue with your family members tonight about this, we're just talking about evidence of controlled demolition. Okay? You don't want to argue with a structural engineer or a firefighter or a fire protection engineer about the capability of the structure. It's irrelevant. So we're going to be looking at the sudden onset of destruction. Okay? How sudden is it? And where is it? Is it at the bottom, like Building 7? No. At the point of jet plane impacts. Why? Because these are deceptive controlled demolitions. It's a magic show. They want us to be looking at the planes, at the large fireball. Intuitively, we are vulnerable to belief in magicians' work. And that's what we're looking at here. What's really going on is behind the scenes, in the columns, as we'll see. And we'll be looking for sounds, therefore, of explosions, flashes of light. Who sees and hears these things? Well, the first responders did. In fact, 118 of them did. And these are recorded on the oral histories. But we didn't know that until August of 2005, because this material was withheld from the American people until the New York Times sued the city to get it. And the State Court of Appeals gave it to them. And here it is, the oral histories, they're called. And they're full of these kinds of reports. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking, heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. Figured it was a bomb because it looked like a deliberate, synchronized kind of thing. Well, what are they talking about? Here's the North Tower on the right. Here's a known controlled demolition on the left. Let's see if there's any similarity. Once again, a sudden onset of destruction. A band of explosions, which we're going to be talking about. In the case of this controlled demolition, doesn't have to start at the base. Controlled demolitions can start anywhere. Fascinating. Seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. And the flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and the building had started to explode. Now here's the South Tower on the right, another controlled demolition known to be so on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since every high-rise that has come down almost has been brought down with controlled demolition, and none have been brought down by fire. But NIST went straight, again, to the hypothesis of fire. Why? They had an agenda, and they ignored the evidence here. Not one of these testimonies of explosions appear in the final report of NIST for the Twin Towers. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was. A crackling explosive.
Started running floor by floor instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated. If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
Are these witnesses credible? Why aren't they a part of the official story? Well, let's take a physics lesson. This is pretty important. We're going to run a Volkswagen into a Mack truck. What happens? An equal and opposite destructive force occurs. Newton's third law. It's not that bad. It's not that hard to understand. The bumper of the Mack truck is going to take some damage. Enough damage as the Volkswagen is capable. And the Volkswagen is going to get decimated. And it can't run through the Mack truck even if we drop it. It's the same concept, right? So the lighter part of a structure cannot possibly destroy the heavier, stronger, more massive part of the structure below it. This right here is a physics lesson that completely pulls the rug out from underneath the official myth of 9/11, and I've got dozens more. Let's look at the actual destruction. Here we have, above the point of jet plane impacts, a 12 or 15 story section that we're told drove the rest of the building down. What you're going to see right now is that it itself is being destroyed just like the Volkswagen would in the first 4 seconds. No movement down until now. So how can it drive the rest of the building down? I'll make it a little easier for you. It is being destroyed internally. The structure is being shattered. It's what we would call a liquid. And as such, it can't destroy the rest of the building. It's like dropping a sack of flour on your head, which would break your neck, or dumping the flour on your head out of the bag, which you would survive much easier. This is not available to break the neck of the building below it. Let's take a look now in a stop-start fashion with, just like the fireman said, bands of explosions. Rapidly developing right here, symmetrically, all around the building. We're told, again, the block drove. In none of these photos or videos can you find a block of 12 or 15 stories after 4 seconds. It's gone. In fact, this is what you see. It looks more like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea with an upward, outward, arching geometry of fireworks in a symmetry, with laterally ejecting structural elements followed by thick pyroclastic clouds, evidence of something burning on the ends of these beams. Is it a collapse or is it an explosion? Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. We're putting on some new glasses. We're looking at this differently. When they showed us built the Twin Towers on 9/11, they said, oh, this is a collapse caused by the jet plane impacts and the resulting fires. So they're telling us it's an apple, but what we're watching is an orange, further putting us in a state of cognitive dissonance and programming us because we're vulnerable to the shock and awe of that morning, which we were all put in by these violent acts that we hadn't experienced in the U.S. since Pearl Harbor, which was way out in Hawaii. So we just haven't experienced this. I'm also quite moved by the levels of explosions going on underneath this zone of destruction. We're told a pancaking collapse up above, but all of these explosions down below. Look on the right side of this, down in the corner, racing down ahead of the destruction above, almost as fast as the freely falling debris, this series of explosions. We'll get a close-up look at those, actually. Does it come straight down? Is it symmetrical? Is it into its footprint? Well, it's pretty symmetrical. Again, a geometry of fireworks. Symmetry is there. A collapse would not create this kind of symmetry. 207-foot wide building, the debris is 1,200 to 14 feet all around. Outside the boundaries of ground zero, completely destroying the winter gardens 600 feet away, in a massive distribution of shattered structural elements versus the nice, neat pile known as the implosion of Building 7. So a classic implosion for Building 7, a very explosive event for the Twin Towers. No, it didn't fall into its footprint. And that's why, because the explosives that were put in there had a different agenda. They weren't trying to preserve other buildings around it, like the Building 7, which was actually between two very, very nice buildings. One of them a historic post office. Apparently they desired to save it. And explosive charges going off. Well, we're told this is air, but it's not air. It's pulverized building materials. And if it were air, well, say this is the open office planning that we saw in Twin Towers design. And back there is the elevator hoistway. And behind me is the exterior structure. And that large mass, which we saw wasn't existing, but is pushing air down like a piston, and that air is going to rush into here. It's going to blow out all those windows at once if it takes any of them out, right? Not these highly specific, pinpoint accurate, violent points of ejections that occur in an obviously engineered manner. So we have problems. And then they occur also at 160 to 200 feet per second. That is explosively propelled speeds. And they're occurring 20, 40, even 60 stories down below the destruction. How does that happen? They must be mistimed. Well, how fast is the building coming down? Let's count and see. Here's 3 seconds, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, about a dozen seconds, both of these buildings has reached the ground. Now that is just about free fall acceleration. They're getting faster and faster and faster. This is extraordinary. How can it go straight down faster and faster through that as if it's not even there? And those interior massive core columns, 47 of them, they had to have been taken out to facilitate that speed, that acceleration, resulting in the total dismemberment of the steel structure. Just like Building 7, one beam from another, completely shattered. The NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, says, and they wrote the explosion and investigation manual for all firefighters and fire investigators. If there's a shattering of the structure, then you should look for explosives. Okay? That's pretty basic. NIST helped to write the NFPA, National Fire Protection Association 921. They should know how to follow it. It was not followed. The structures shattered well beyond the perimeter of these buildings. Let's look at the shattering of the South Tower. It also is destroyed in a telescoping fashion, but it's leaning, isn't it? In fact, it leans to the side 22 degrees. Theoretically, it would continue its angular momentum. But what happens is it's destroyed from the bottom, so it sinks back into its own seat there, and after that, it's gone. There's nothing left to push the rest of the building down to the ground. But watch what's happening down below it. What are we looking at? A collapse or a series of explosions? Does it look like a gravitational collapse? Or does it look like an explosion? What about that steel? Watch. These pieces are landing 300 feet away, freely flying. This is not like a banana peeling off the side of the tower like they like to tell you and try to explain this lateral ejection. These are freely flying objects, which are large, most of them perimeter. But look at this one coming out the side here. That's 45 degrees. When you shoot a cannonball out of a castle, it goes horizontal not very long, but gravity begins to take over. How do you get the horizontal element of these freely flying objects? They have to be propelled, and that propulsion is accounted for only with explosives, like in a cannon. 200-pound cannon the same energy, it would take a 200-pound cannonball to be shot 3 miles. And there's a lot of these structural steel sections that are shot out, as you saw. But what about the floor sections? These buildings were 110 stories tall, okay? Huge. And each of them were an acre in size, like Building 7. Where are those floors? Let's look. They're gone. This is what both piles look like. There's a 2-story pile of core columns, perimeter columns, miscellaneous metal. That's what we would be looking for, 110 of those, if there was a real gravitational collapse. Where are they? This is pretty incredible. Well, I'm going to show you what happens to the concrete in those floors and the metal decking underneath the concrete floor. They use the metal decking to pour the concrete in. 220 acres of that metal decking is missing. How did that happen in a gravitational collapse? There's no concrete down here, or very little. We're talking about mass 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized in midair. Not down at the ground because it crashed and fell down there and broke into 1,000 million little tiny pieces. We're talking about 90,000 tons of 100 micron particles. This is a fine dust spread river to river across lower Manhattan. "30% of that dust is concrete."
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel.
What happened to the concrete?
The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
Well, what was in that dust? Let's take a look. This is pretty important. In fact, NFPA, which we talked about, says, hey, you should look for thermal effects, i.e. molten iron or molten steel, because that would indicate incendiaries. Didn't look for it. But others did. Bechtel documents 2,800 degree temperatures in the pile. That's Fahrenheit. We're talking maybe 1,400 degrees Celsius. This is the melting point of steel or iron that jet fuel and office fires can't even approach. Peter Tully, the president of the cleanup company, says you saw pools of literally molten steel. In fact, it's pouring out of the South Tower 10 minutes prior to its collapse. Bright orange, bright yellow. This is not aluminum, as NIST has tried to show us or tell us. Aluminum is silvery in daylight conditions. It can only be iron or steel. And that molten material corroded and dissolved and partially evaporated many of these beams, as very clearly documented by structural engineers and other workers. Partially evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures, 2,000 degrees Celsius temperatures. Fires can't even get these fires in particular, maybe a quarter of those temperatures. But in Appendix C of FEMA's work in 2002, they very carefully document what happened to this steel. They say it's capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese. They say molten iron invaded the steel. They say, or they don't say, but in the museum, there's molten concrete wrapped around police guns in Building 6, which was one of the buildings that took a lot of damage from the Twin Towers. How do you melt concrete? I had never heard of this. I didn't think it could happen. 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,500 degrees Celsius, you got flowing concrete. Try it sometime. That's proof of temperatures that completely are unexplained by the official story. Yet this gentleman of the official story, John Gross, states his own opinion about this material.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava
from a volcano.
And no eyewitness who said so.
There actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult. The steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks at least.
Nobody who's produced it.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Somebody's lying here. It's either this gentleman from NIST or all of these first responders and structural engineers. You have to decide for yourself. What I've decided is that this gentleman, John Gross, who's found the piece of molten steel, partially evaporated steel, that is, the end of this beam, and cut it off and gave it to FEMA to analyze, and then took the results of that analysis and threw it out the window when the official NIST report came out. That's more fraud. That's tampering with the evidence so that you can produce a different result. And these fires are only 650 degrees Celsius by this particular official supporter's estimate. The structural steel melts maybe 1,510 degrees, molten iron also. What can be producing that? We're going to look at one possibility, thermite, an incendiary that has some really interesting properties, like issuing molten iron at 2,500 degrees Celsius. And we'll see, is there chemical evidence of such thermite? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
This is fascinating. In fact, NFPA 921 once again says, look for thermite. NIST, of course, did not. Others did. In fact, in the dust are found these, by USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, and R.J. Lee, billions and billions of these small iron microspheres. Well, what are they doing there? They have no idea. They don't even speculate. But 6% of some of these dust samples are composed of iron. I'm talking elemental iron microspheres, not melted steel. In fact, there are so many of them, they say it's a signature element. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has all these unknown, unsourced iron spheres. Well, if you had thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building, and under explosive conditions, the byproduct of that thermite, liquid molten iron, emphasis on liquid, what would happen to that liquid? It would aerosolize not too differently than this water that's sprayed out of a spray bottle. Tens of thousands of iron water microspheres. And they're about the diameter of a human hair, same size as the molten iron microspheres. And they would cool and fall with all of the dust. And maybe before they cool, they could be responsible for the toasting of these tops of these cars. Liquid molten iron droplets, I would imagine, could do that. So we have a lot of interesting data here all coming together. Thermite and slow motion. Right here, thousands and thousands of iron microspheres. That's just how thermite works, even without explosives. When we analyze the microspheres found in the World Trade Center dust, we find that they have the same characteristics of an experiment very similar to the one you just saw. So we know it's thermite, right? It's got iron, aluminum, manganese, oxygen, silica, all that good stuff. That's pretty interesting. So a small team of scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen gathers 4 samples from people who saved this dust for a number of years and sent it to them because they heard of their interest in it. And they look at these dust samples, which were collected in these particular places under very strict conditions, which are very well documented, such as the apartment building of Jeanette McKinley, living right across the street from the South Tower. Her whole place was full of this dust. She was breathing it, and unfortunately she's died of cancer, probably as a result of that since. So one of these samples of small red-gray chips is from her apartment. But they're the same samples, or same red-gray chips they find in all 4 independently collected samples. These are fascinating. They come up to a magnet, so they have iron in them, which is very interesting in and of itself. But they go and look at the chemical nature of the red layer, and they find what? It has iron in it, aluminum, silica, oxygen, carbon. The key ingredients of thermite are in this dual-layered red-gray chip, the red layer. What's thermite doing in all the World Trade Center dust samples? This is really important. But they've got electron microscopes. They can zoom in 50,000 times. They can see very small rhomboidal-shaped iron oxide particles and platelets of aluminum that are 40 nanometers thick. These particles are at the nanoscale. They are 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. They're not made by putting this material in a blender and blending it up. They're manufactured in a very sophisticated technical process from the atomic scale up. What's it doing in all the World Trade Center dust? When they put them in a heater, guess what happens? At 420 Celsius, they ignite. They produce a lot more heat, making them energetic materials, very sophisticated once again. And when they heat up, what do? They emit these iron microspheres, the exact same iron microspheres, the exact same signature as the ones found in the World Trade Center dust. So there's no question about where those iron microspheres came from. They came from those red-gray chips, at least the ones that were ignited during the World Trade Center destruction. Wow. We're getting somewhere here. In fact, we already knew where they came from because a lot of the chips, partially ignited chips, have these iron microspheres attached to them. So there's no question about where they came from. In fact, this material was developed in Los Alamos lab, Lawrence Livermore lab, and prior to 9/11 by defense contractors like Foreman Williams of SAIC, who was brought in to lead specific parts of the NIST investigation at the World Trade Center. So we have the wolves in charge of the sheep, really. Pretty fascinating. They could easily have found this stuff. They're experts in it. Again, this is a very sophisticated process, not made in a cave in Afghanistan. So we need an investigation, don't we? Well, we've got what we need for it. It's very well documented in a 24-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. And it has not been contested. The way to stamp out somebody's conspiracy theory in the scientific community is to publish a paper of your own refuting their results. This has not been done. So here's the paper, and you can go online, just type thermitic materials in the World Trade Center dust. You can read it yourself. It's fascinating. What have we shown tonight? I believe the hypothesis of controlled demolition is corroborated, that we've shown all 10 characteristic features and uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition, explosive destruction. Fire can't create any one of these, let alone all 10 of them. With additional corroborating evidence, is this proof to you of controlled demolition? We've seen that explosives and incendiaries were most likely responsible for the destruction of these skyscrapers. And of course, it takes months of planning and engineering to place and engineer these explosives. Who had the means, the opportunity, the motive to engage in this crime? These are the questions that criminal investigators and enterprising journalists should be asking, but are not. Who had access to these highly secure buildings? Who had access to these extremely sophisticated incendiaries that are engineered to become explosives? Due to their extremely small size, they have a massive surface area, very responsive to immediate chemical reaction, and placed in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, and carbon, add to the gas expansion responsible for explosive force. So you have an incendiary engineered to become explosive. Well, who's responsible for that? The architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth don't speculate about these issues. We don't have conspiracy theories or a political agenda. The evidence you've seen is just a small fraction of that which the overall 9/11 Truth movement has assembled. A vast body of information is available to you for further research. The questions here are numerous and ominous that must be answered in a real investigation that offers immunity to bring forth witnesses, that takes testimony under oath, that examines all of the evidence, and using the scientific method to do just that. So this is just the beginning of an admittedly disturbing but essential opportunity for you to uncover the rest of the mystery. But what do we have to do? We got some follow-up work. Put pressure on this gentleman to read that petition for a new investigation in Parliament. And run for Parliament yourself. It's actually not that difficult. $1,000 down and 100 signatures gets you started. We have 4 from the event that we had in Prince George a couple of nights ago, 2 more in Vancouver. Who here is willing to seriously consider running for Parliament on the platform of 9/11 Truth? Anybody? Yes! 1. Anybody? 2. Anybody over here? I saw a hand go up, and I saw it go down faster than it came up. Would I see another one? Where's my first one? I'm not going to bring you up on stage. This isn't church. But what's your name? Brad. Let's give a big hand to Brad, a show of courage. Come on up here. Jesus, no, I'm just kidding. And the second gentleman? Lady? I'm sorry. Who was that? Oh, that's the third one then. And are you a fourth one? What's your name? What? Sorry? Harlow. What? Art Roller. Art Lowell. Good, close enough. And in the back. Josh Stetler. Will you talk to Elizabeth and Brian? Brian, will you stand up? Brian, you'll remember the gentleman with the white hair. That makes him older than me. Thank goodness. And there's a lady who raised her hand. Where are you? A young lady. I don't want to miss you. This is really important because when we get to Newfoundland, we want 30 to 40 Parliament member candidates to speak out about 9/11. We're not going to tell you how you have to do it, how much money you have to spend. You can just do it with $1,000 and a lot of courage, right? You're going to be speaking. I don't even know what you do. Somebody come up here and tell us what you have to do or what you want to do, and as easy as it can be during our question and answer session, which I'm going to shut up and start listening to your questions in just a minute. In the meantime, look how much support we offer you. Technical evidence and T-shirts to spread the word, right? There's all different kinds of ways. You can email people. You can be a loudmouth at Parliament or with the media. You can give people DVDs. A lot of things you can do. And again, these are available in the back. You can get David Ray Griffin's if you're a reader. He's got a lot of great material to read. It's available on our website. Be sure to sign our petition right here for a new investigation as well, and become an AE 9/11 Truth local contact. We can't have enough of these. We'll put your name, your email on our website. Then people looking at our website from Victoria or nearby cities, wherever you are, they can call you and ask you questions. If you feel like you can answer questions, become a local contact. If you feel like you want to go out and do something with other people, start an action group. We'll put your action group, hopefully you meet monthly, you're doing things, you'll be on our website under action groups. We want several hundred action groups around the world this year. That's our goal. Whatever you do, follow your conscience and act. After all, if we allow the truth about 9/11 to be swept under the rug of history, we'll have more false flag attacks on Americans, more wars around the world, millions more killed, more economic manipulation with worsening financial crisis, more loss of civil liberties, and of course we become a whole lot less safe. Whereas the truth about 9/11 illuminates these lies and more importantly results in the rectification of each of these disasters. So we see 9/11 in a whole new light as a means of exposing massive corruption to its heights. More importantly, though, as a way of recovering from its ills. So where do you draw your line in the sand? Do you wait for the next 9/11? Predicted by members of our Congress in the U.S. to be far worse than the last. No, speak the truth, because a time comes when your silence is betrayal. Thank you so very much.